We saw in game one what was possible using this outwardly modest idea, which brings us naturally to game two, which is the game Stankovic versus Bogdanovsky, which was played in Belgrade in 2007. The player with the black pieces is graded 24-30, so he's obviously pretty strong. The opening moves are now becoming familiar to us, with black retreating the queen all the way back to d8, and then white setting up the contours of the main line by pushing his pawn up to d4 and bringing his bishop out to c4. And as we are now discovering, this refinement in move order, where black delays the move knight f6, is a good one, taking most of the sting out of white's dangerous attacking plans. Well, white played knight f3. I think this will be the reaction of the vast majority of your opponents, and now black puts a block on the bishop with e6. So I ask you, what could be simpler than this as an opening system? Not a lot to remember. Just get the bishop outside the pawn chain and shut up shop with e6. Well, in this game, faced with this unknown system, as it were, this untheoretical idea, white decides to play h3. And now that knight e5 and the advance of the kingside pawns has been halted, black decides to revert to normal play by playing knight f6. Bishop out to f4. And as white hasn't revealed his hand, we don't quite know where he's going to castle yet. Maybe it'd be kingside, maybe it'd be queenside. Black decides to play more aggressively than normal by putting his bishop out on b4. Obviously bishop e7 is possible, bishop d6 is also possible, but bishop b4 is the most aggressive move at black's disposal, and black is certainly thinking about ideas now such as queen a5 and knight e4 or knight d5, putting pressure on the c3 knight. So white decides to castle and not worry too much about his king being in a pin. You know, obviously he could move his queen and castle on the queen side, but then the move bishop b4 shows its strength. It really is an anti-castling queenside move, you could say. Anyway, in this particular game, Bogdanovsky decides to damage white's pawn structure by taking on c3. Slightly controversial move, because black is obviously giving up the bishop pair. He's also got to be a little bit careful his pawn on b7 doesn't become weakened and subject to attack now that the b file is open. But Bogdanovsky seems to cope quite easily with any difficulties the bishop pair might allow white to create, and just sticks his knight on d5. Well, that's a fork of the bishop on f4 and the pawn on c3. So white retreats to d2. The bishop pair really is white's only trump in this position. I mean, already his position is worse. So black decides to castle, and now white plays very logically rook to b1. So this is perfectly straightforward play by white, and probably his best move as well. Black drops the knight back to b6. Bishop drops back to b3. And now black just brings his pieces out, knight 8 to d7. a4. Well, we couldn't fault that move. White is obviously intending to budge that knight on b6 out of the way, and again try to mount pressure on b7. Knight f6. Black is not flustered by this idea in the least, because he understands that when the pawn goes to a5, that pawn is at least as weak as black's own pawn on b7. So white plays bishop g5. Let's not forget the bishop, the dark square bishop, is white's main trump in this position. That is the piece black doesn't have. So white is trying to use it as aggressively as he can. Again, perfectly logical play. Let's note that a5, knight d5, bishop takes d5 is answered by queen takes d5. And now I think black is better, despite the fact that white can take on b7, because black takes on a5. And well, in this position I start to like black, despite the active rook. I like the potential of black's a pawn. I like his control of the light squares, and c4 only loosens white's position after queen a6. So there's no doubt about it, black has a very reasonable position already in this game. So bishop g5, very logical. and black just drops his knight back to d7, freeing up his queen. As the bishop's on b3, there's no pressure on b7 just yet. Queen goes to e2, h6, bishop f4, and now knight coming into e4. So this is absolutely standard play, I would say, for this opening. Black is keeping the bishop pair at bay, and he's now focusing on the weak white pawns on the queen side. Queen e3, queen a5. Well, if white doesn't play c4 here, I'm not actually sure how he defends that pawn on c3. So he plays c4, but now black is quick to play c5, shutting down the bishop on b3. So this position is really starting to look quite promising for black. White pushed on with d5, hoping black will take, which liberates the bishop on b3 to a degree. No such luck, as black plays just the simple move, rook f e8. White plays rook b e1, seeing no future on the b file, and black just makes a kind of prophylactic move there, dropping the bishop back out of harm's way, and really asking white, what are you doing in this position? Well, knight goes back to d2. White is saying, I'm going to get rid of your best posting piece. I think white kept his rook on f1 in this position because he's entertaining some hopes of actually pushing this pawn at some point. Of course, that is some way off. But knight d2 is perhaps the start of that process. All the same, white's position is not especially impressive. So black just drops back, leaving white with awkward pieces. Queen f3, I'm not sure white can see exactly what to do. And now Bogdanovsky plays d5, shutting down the bishops even more. And really, it's all about this passed pawn on d5. Is it strong or weak? Well, obviously, the pawn has potential to tie the black pieces down, but as of yet, I'm not sure I see how that pawn is going to advance any further, and exactly what development planned by black that pawn is hampering. I mean, you know, you could just imagine a black knight coming to d6 in this position. I mean, that would be a wonderful blockading square for the knight. So, the assessment remains unchanged. I think black is slightly better here. Alright, bishop e3. Queen c7. Queen g3, setting up the threat of bishop takes h6. So black parks his king in the corner. Now f4, so it's all starting to make sense. White really can't see how he's going to get the rook on f1 out unless he plays f4. Of course, this does step in though to knight h5, which is exactly what Bogdanovsky did. Queen came to f3, and now there was an exchange on f4. Off came the bishops, off came the queens. Of course, now white has to interject the move rook takes e8 check. Black recaptures, rook takes f4, and now pawn up to f6. Well, let's try and assess this endgame. It's not particularly easy to assess. I think black is better. I don't think there's any doubt about that. He's got control of the open file. He's got the much better pawn structure, and by far the superior bishop. However, white does have two things going in his favour. He's got the passed pawn on d5, which black is not really able to challenge for the time being, and he's got his king close to the centre. So these two aspects of the endgame obviously have to be respected, and with white's king having the ability to come into the game quicker than black's king, you know, black's got to be a little bit careful how he gradually exploits this advantage. Alright, a5, shutting down the bishop even more on b3. Rook comes to f2, king g8, rook e2, and black is happy to exchange. Rook takes e2, king takes e2. Up comes the king. Knight goes to b1. White is looking for a good outpost for the knight. Perhaps he intends to bring that knight to b5. King e7, knight c3, and now black's own knight comes to the wonderful outpost on e5. I ask you, have you seen in chess a worse bishop than white's overgrown pawn on b3? And yet, when you consider the previous course of the game, I don't think white has done anything particularly wrong. I think he just basically didn't come to terms with the problems black's opening system is posing. It looks so modest, and yet, as we've seen, it can give black very good chances. Alright, king e3, white is still making perfectly plausible moves. And now the knight heads for this beautiful square d6 perhaps, which white is anxious to prevent with knight b5. Bishop f5, the bishop comes back into the game. g4, bishop d7, so the point of bringing the bishop back into the game is revealed. I think black could even be thinking about taking that knight off and going into an endgame with good knight against bad bishop. You might ask, how is black going to win this endgame? Well, let's note his pawn majority on the king side. I think this is basically black's plan. He wants to create a passed pawn, tie white down over there, and then move in with his king and demolish white's queen side. That basically is the winning plan, if black can get it together. Well, white's not interested in having that knight exchanged, so he just goes back to c3. And now black plays f5, a useful prod, which again forces white's hand. White's probably got to take, and then he's got to play h4, excuse me. But it's all coming to pass. I mean, you can see black is going through methodically the idea of creating a pass pawn. No matter how hard white tries, he's not going to be able to stop black from creating that pawn. He tried knight b5, here comes g5, h takes g5, h takes g5, king g3, and now just simply knight f7. And as we can see, this pass pawn is really cramping white's style. Really an object lesson in how to play endgames of this type. Black is intending to decide the game on the queen side, as I say. What he wants to do is to march that queen all the way in and start gobbling white. Right, knight f7 was the last move, c3, trying to hamper the king's progress, and at last, white's bishop sees a glimmer of light. King e5, knight a3, bishop d7, really cramping white's style. That bishop would love to be able to free itself, but it's chained to the pawn on a4. So bishop d1, knight d6, chaining the knight to a3. So king f3, but I mean, basically, white's scarcely got another move. Here's the winning plan, knight c8. He's coming in to target that pawn on a4. Knight b5, what else? Knight b6, here we go. Bishop b3. Bishop takes b5. This is the move we've been waiting for. And it's an incredibly strong move, of course. If white takes with the c pawn, he loses the pawn on d5. If he takes with the a pawn, black's own a pawn advances. Bishop a2, a3. Really is a miserable position for white. Knight a4. King takes g5, knight takes c3, of course, with the action now taking place only on the queen side exclusively. The knight is towering over the bishop, and in fact, white has to give up the bishop. Well, not much future now for white at all. King f7, king d6, denying the white king access to the queen side, and as the black knight is about to have a field day, white decided to resign. Now that is a terrific game by black. It's a terrific game which helps us to understand our system in every conceivable respect. And it certainly points up the positive aspects of putting the bishop on b4. As I say, you know, a lot of the other minor pieces, the two knights and the bishop on c8, are fairly standard in their positions in the opening. The knight comes to f6, the knight goes to d7, the bishop comes to f5. But black does have choices with his bishop on f8. And as I say, this game really did highlight the positive virtues of bishop b4.